All right, YouTube, in the wake of the Scientology documentary that everybody seems to be talking about, I realized that I actually hadn't made a video about Scientology. I've made videos about Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Mormonism. I've spoken briefly about the Jehovah's Witnesses, but I hadn't actually made one against Scientology. So I think now is probably the time to do it while people are interested in knowing more about their group. I have not seen the documentary, so probably some of what I'm going to talk about here is probably there as well. And it's kind of common knowledge. Most people understand that Scientology is a fruitcake cult. It's sort of like the Jehovah's Witnesses. It's a little less like Mormonism. Mormonism's a bit less extreme. I think Jehovah's Witnesses are probably the best example we can give of a similar group. And I would like to point something out. Now, others have pointed this out. I'm actually surprised that more people have noticed this because they probably wouldn't have said this sort of thing like 5 years ago. The founding basis of Scientology is bunk. It's based on science fiction. L. Ron Hubbard was a sci-fi writer. However, I can't criticize Scientology for that any more than I can criticize any other religion. Because to me, and to I think many rational individuals, there's really not a lot of difference. When you're talking about weird material that claims to be older than it is, that claims all sorts of miraculous inspiration and miraculous content, it really doesn't matter what that content is. It's hokum, it's superstition, it's bunk. In that sense, Scientology really is no different from mainstream Christianity, so-called, or mainstream Islam, or Judaism, or Hinduism, or any of these other groups. So I really can't say much more about that other than Hubbard was a sci-fi writer. It's fairly clear where he got the ideations in his mind from to construct his church. I think the more valid criticism of Scientology is the same sort of criticism that could be levied against a group like the Jehovah's Witnesses. Again, as opposed to what we would consider moderate or even liberal groups within most so-called mainstream religions. As opposed to them, there is a doctrinal system in place within Scientology, as with, again, those same Jehovah's Witnesses, that's about the same, in which there is a deliberate attempt to deconstruct people's psyches, draw them in, control them, prevent them from leaving. If they do leave, to prevent them from criticizing. If they do criticize, to prevent them from continuing to do so. That, I think, is the real beef that people have with Scientology, above and beyond just the mystical content. Because, I mean, let's face it, I was a Satanist for a while. Not a member of the Church of Satan, but a Satanist anyway, philosophically speaking. And I still like the philosophy. I realize Anton LaVey was a con man. I realize that a lot of the material that he peddled was taken from older sources. I realize he was an atheist who really didn't believe in Satan, or mysticism, or magic beyond the psychological realm. I realize all these things. But when I look at the doctrine and I look at how the average Satanist appears to function, I say it's more or less benign. It's difficult to distinguish any real difference between the way they would act and the way some individual who's agnostic and doesn't care would act. And I know some Christians and Muslims would say, well, they, kill children and stuff. No, you're thinking of like devil-worshipping cults, which would really have more in common with something like Scientology than LaVeyan Satanism. But be that as it may, I can look at some religious groups and I can say the dogma may be the same. It may have the same mystical nonsense in it, but the actions of the actual adherents are different. I pointed this out with regards to Christianity and Islam. There is a definite differentiation made between the way in which a mainstream Christian and a mainstream Muslim thinks, and it is on that basis that I differentiate the two for the purposes of criticizing them. As far as the doctrine goes, it doesn't really matter. With Scientology, it's really more about control. It's quite deliberate. Dianetics and all of this other material, all the Xenu and all the weird mumbo-jumbo that they have within their doctrine, is specifically aimed at fucking with people's minds. It's the hallmark of a cult. It is an attempt to deconstruct their view of reality, build up a new one in which they are more easily controlled. It's remarkably a fairly simple process. It's done all the time by people with mediocre at best intelligence towards the members of their own family, especially towards their children, or by a senior member of a cult towards somebody who happens to be younger. It's astonishingly simple. It's really not that difficult to deconstruct a person's view of reality. All you have to do is get them questioning things. You start chipping away at the foundation of all of their beliefs, and then you institute some synthesis upon which they can ideally they themselves will piece it together in a pre-formatted manner, because you're feeding it to them in little chunks and allowing them to take the bricks and find the way in which they fit. That's the way you get somebody to deconstruct their psyche. Now this can be done for positive reasons. You can deconstruct somebody's psyche in order to alleviate them of pain, in order to alleviate them of guilt. Scientology, though, seeks to do it to create pain, to create guilt, or at least to create a situation in which if the person leaves, they will not feel comfortable in their own skin without extensive therapy. And even when they do become comfortable, it then allows various triggers to be employed by members of the church, as we've seen in numerous YouTube videos, to thrust them back into discomfort. This has been done by Scientologists towards former members as well as critics. And you can see it in their faces and you can hear it in their words, that these individuals are by them considered to be weak-minded apostates that are easily controlled specifically because they've undergone processing by the Scientological method. I don't know if that's actually a term they would use, but I'm going to coin it now. Scientological method. That's what they use. Fuck you. Anyway, it's basically the same as what the Jehovah's Witnesses did long before Scientology existed. And little grassroots cults spring up all the time to do the same thing. The Jehovah's Witnesses control people partially by getting their family and friends involved, creating these tight-knit communities in which once a person leaves, the rest of their family and friends are thrust into a dilemma over whether to be sort of praised, because the idea of praise and punishment is so deeply ingrained in their psyche by the Jehovah's Witnesses. The other person leaves. Those around them that like them are then pressured into sort of choosing, well, one of three roads. Either they stop talking to that person altogether and they get praise. They keep talking to them and they get punished psychologically. Or they can leave the movement altogether. And it's a difficult choice for people to make. Most often, they'll continue attempting to associate for a while and then they'll move right back into the church and sort of believe the nonsense about them being a horrible apostate. Mainstream religions do this too, let's face it. Scientology simply takes it to a new level. It's got that in common with Mormonism, which is slightly similar. It's not quite as violent and overt as with the Jehovah's Witnesses, which come later. But the similarities go further than just, well, Joseph Smith was known to be a shyster and a con man and wrote weird stories that he knew weren't true and then made a religion out of them. In that way, L. Ron Hubbard is the same. L. Ron Hubbard is just a century later decided to take the basic story of Joseph Smith's life, modernize it, throw in some of the more abusive tenets of something like the Jehovah's Witnesses, and make up a bunch of nonsense in order to get people to believe in his cult and essentially give him money. Scientology has become sort of the pastime of bored people in Hollywood who don't know any better because half the time they're completely addled on drugs anyway. Of course they're seeking guidance. Of course they're seeking some higher power. It might as well be Xenu for them because they're so fucking far gone, but no, Scientology is a bunch of nonsense. Any reasonable individual understands that. There's in the case of Scientology, there's not even really a historical context for it. Like something like Mormonism adapts older religions, tries to vainly copy aspects of them and sort of make a new story around them. Islam basically does the same thing when you think about it. Christianity did the same thing with Judaism, and Judaism did the same thing with Sumerian lore. So you've got this never-ending bullshit piled upon bullshit making these new splinter group religions. Then you've got Scientology, which sort of said fuck it to all of that and used basically a series of science fiction novels as the founding basis of its entire philosophy. It's really, you could make a similarity with like Trekkie culture. You know, some people who role play that but take it a little bit too seriously, and probably some people have met them, or someone who's into like Batman stuff or Superman, you know, comics in general, or anything that's like fantastical in that nature. Anything like that can be adapted. And there will be those who enjoy it more casually, and then there'll be those who will attempt to form some sort of secret society or religion out of it. You know, an actual Church of Adam doesn't sound too bad as long as the right person founds it. But if you've got some semi-charismatic and semi-talented person who then uses it for their own financial gain and their own social gain, like Hubbard, or like Joseph Smith, or like the Watchtower Society or something like that, then it becomes abusive. As opposed to something like even Heaven's Gate is less abusive. The tale goes from the Heaven's Gate cult. They were, by the way, in the mid-90s, they thought, I think it was Hale Bopp, they thought that the comet was coming back and it was going to take them to the cosmic realm of the reincarnation of Christ or something. So they killed themselves. They got into their weird sneakers and put their purple robes on and drank, you know, I think it was cyanide Kool-Aid or something, and killed themselves. Or maybe it was Jim Jones that did the cyanide Kool-Aid. One of them used arsenic, I think. Arsenic vodka, and then the other was cyanide Kool-Aid. I don't know which one was which. And that's sort of a similar story, these mass suicide cults. But there were also tales from those right before that incident who said they decided not to go along with it and just leave. And apparently nobody tried to stop them. They said, okay, well, you know, see you later. You know, you can't come with us to heaven, I guess, but, you know, whatever. They didn't, you know, take a pickaxe to them or chase them through the street screaming at them or do anything else. They just sort of let them go and then killed themselves. And it's the same with Raelianism. Raelianism has never, I think it's mainly a French cult at this point. Raelianism has never had a specific problem because they're essentially pacifistic. But they do have the weird beliefs. They came out when I was a little kid, they came out and claimed they had cloned a human, which turned out to be bunk, of course. They did it for attention, but they claimed it anyway. I think they stand against like nuclear weapons and stuff and pro-environmentalism. That's okay, I guess. But Scientology does take that psychological abuse aspect to an entirely new level. I think that sane, reasonable individuals who sort of have a grasp on their lives and on their minds are probably not going to be tempted to join the so-called Church of Scientology. You look at their building, it looks weird. You look at the way they speak, and it's strange. These people's minds have been fried essentially by psychological damage imparted to them from other Scientologists, which is exactly why they stalk and harass former Scientologists. It's the same thing. Well, and actually, in that sense, it's different from the Jehovah's Witnesses. If you leave the Jehovah's Witnesses, people just won't associate with you. They're not going to stalk you down and say, heretic, heretic, while throwing, you know, vials of holy water at you. They'll just ignore your existence and not associate with you. With Scientology, they'll probably, you know, pull up next to you in the lane of traffic or in the airport or something and say, you know, nobody believes you, nobody likes you, nobody takes you seriously. It's an attempt to trigger the same ingrained psychological harm that they themselves have already done. And if they were to leave Scientology, they would be privy to the same sort of treatment. It's a cult. It's not a religion. It's a cult. It's got that classic psychological hallmark that some of these other groups do. It's not like, you know, a Unitarian church where you walk in, go to service, and walk out, nobody gives a damn. Nobody's going to chase you down and say, you heretic, you left the church. It's not like even certain Islamic groups don't do that. They honestly don't care. They don't have a problem if you lean towards secularity. I think Scientology is one of the most psychologically brutal, certainly, cults that's ever existed, although their size and their actual capabilities have been actually quite overblown when you really stop to think about it. Their capabilities, they delve into the technological, they're tech literate, unlike some. I mean, have you ever heard of the Jehovah's Witnesses, you know, chat room meetup group? It's just not going to happen. Scientologists actually will use the internet, which gives them less of a handicap. Some of these other groups, they shun technology and they wonder why they wither and have no support. Even the Mormons have embraced that. Again, you can tell on Goodreads they've done some work there, shit posting and shit voting all across that website. I'm surprised the Scientologists haven't. Apparently, they're warned not to visit 4chan. I wonder fucking why. Because they might meet criticism that actually deconverts some of its members. But yeah, some people actually say, well, I'm afraid to criticize Scientology. I don't want to be harassed by Scientologists. I would say bring it. Who gives a fuck? You know, they're more likely to murder their own members than they are anybody outside of their own crazy organization. So it doesn't really matter much to me. You can spot a Scientologist a mile away too. They've always got that weird dazed look on their face. So you get a good warning when they're approaching you, because you see them sauntering up with their weird clothes and their sort of Spock eyes and all that nonsense. It's really just, it's retarded when you really think about it. They don't like criticism either. I mean, any site where there's too much criticism, they'll try to ban their users from actually accessing. I'm surprised they haven't gone after YouTube, to tell the truth. I would think that'd be a no-brainer, considering you search Scientology on there. What do you find? You're not going to find a lot of support for the organization. So, yeah, there's a little bit about Scientology. Obviously, I'm not a fan of it any more than I'm a fan of even mainstream religions or Mormonism or any of these other weird groups. I think they all have strange beliefs. I think Scientology is just a little more obviously strange because we know where it's from. We know that L. Ron Hubbard was a sci-fi writer. That's what he was for a living. He was writing sci-fi works, sort of like Joseph Smith, only maybe without so much talent, because Scientology is substantially smaller than Mormonism and never almost took over a state. That's about all. Peace out.